Lovely, thank you very much, Joe. I'll start off by saying that I have been lucky to present internationally. I have worked at ministerial level, not just in the UK, but also abroad as well. I've done work with Radio 4 Today programme, with BBC News, ITV News, Sky News. I've spoken to literally tens of thousands of people in hospitals across the UK. I've spoken to the Queen as well. But this is the first time that I've spoken at Milton Keynes. Now, some of you will not be aware of the significance of that, and some of you will. Can I just ask, how many of you here are aware of the significance of me speaking at Milton Keynes? Okay, so that's about half of you. So I'll for those of you who aren't familiar with it, I'll take you back a little bit. I've got a presentation to give you. There are some elements of it that I give when I give presentations, but there are some elements that actually I've never spoken about before until today. But there are three ground rules for me, really. The first is that I talk about the death of my late wife. And I never mention publicly where that happened, and I never mention the names of the staff involved, and I certainly won't be mentioning them today, other than as a generic group, which you'll see later. The second thing is I'm an airline pilot and fly for a major UK airline. I never talk about which airline I fly for, and the reason for that is actually it allows me to do a lot of very public work, and the airline in fact I work for are very, very supportive of what I do. And occasionally some of the work I do in healthcare comes back to help them, which is quite nice to know. And the final thing, just as an aside, some of you here in the room will be aware of something called the Williams Review, which is a government review into the use of gross negligence and manslaughter in healthcare, particularly following the Dr. Burragaba case. And some of you will be aware that I'm actually on that panel. What I will stress is that whatever I say today reflects the views that I've held for a long, long time, and do not in any way reflect the conversations that have gone on as part of the Williams Review, which is due to report fairly soon. But after that fairly long introduction, so back to 2005, I was a fairly junior pilot flying again for a major UK airline. Flying was my life, my passion. I still fly today. I'm a captain for a major UK airline. But the other thing about me was my family. And here I am with Elaine and with our two young children, Victoria and Adam. Victoria was 5, Adam was 4. Elaine had had some sinus problems, and she'd attended Milton Keynes. And the long story, or the short story I should say, is that it had been recommended that she should have routine surgery to sort that problem out. Now, for reasons of personal convenience to do with my flying schedule, we'd opted to have that procedure done privately, and that was arranged at a local healthcare provider. Elaine went in on the 29th of March 2005 for functional endoscopic sinus surgery and a septoplasty. But unfortunately, things didn't work out as we expected. Elaine had been anaesthetised, but problems occurred. And eventually she was transferred across to the intensive care unit here at Milton Keynes. And sadly, she never regained consciousness, and despite the very best care that the team here gave, it became obvious within a few days that this was a situation from which she wasn't going to recover. I made the decision that we would switch her life support off, in conjunction with the team in intensive care, for which I'm ever grateful. And sadly, she died 13 days after the original attempted operation. During that time in the intensive care unit, I was trying to come to terms with many, many things. I obviously had Elaine to think about, who at earlier points I hoped would get better. Perhaps very naively now, I recognise that. I had the two young children who I had to think about. And in the nicest sense, I wasn't terribly interested in what had happened. What I recognised is we'd found ourselves in a position and I didn't know what to do. But the surgeon who'd been waiting to perform the operation had come to speak to me. He'd explained that they'd made all the right decisions and it just didn't work out. And I accepted that. That's life. That happens. And, I just kind of shrugged my shoulders, I suppose, really. But when I spoke to the then head of the intensive care unit about it, I said in my world in aviation, we investigate. We don't investigate to blame anybody. We investigate to learn. And hopefully, there'll be some lessons that might be learnt in this particular case. And he said to me, and this is in a genuine way, a compassionate way, he said to me, look, we won't investigate, not unless you sue or complain. And he really wasn't being horrible. He was just telling me how things were back then. And for me, I think that's where things really changed, because in aviation, we're constantly investigating purely to learn. And here was a case of somebody who was healthy, who was going to be made more healthy, and was actually dead. And I couldn't understand why you wouldn't investigate that to try and understand what could be learned from it. In the end, with the cooperation of a number of staff here in the hospital, we managed to get an independent review done of Elaine's care. And what I'll do is very briefly share with you the story, as best we know it, of what happened that day. Elaine was being cared for by a very experienced anaesthetist and his experienced assistant, a senior ODP, operating department practitioner. They'd done a very thorough pre-op assessment. There were no undue causes for concern. She was anaesthetised at 8:35 on the 29th of March 2005. Very quickly it became obvious that things were not going as they should. Elaine started to turn blue. They planned to use a laryngeal mask, but different sizes of mask. The original mask wasn't fitting. They tried different sizes. 4 minutes in, her oxygenation was 75% or lower. 4 minutes in, we know it was 40% or lower. 6 minutes in, we know that the anaesthetist had already started attempts to intubate, and we know that the senior ODP had called for help. And over the next couple of minutes, the ENT surgeon came in. We know that another anaesthetist came in to see if he could help. We know that another ODP joined them, and we know that 2 recovery nurses came into theatre. And if you can imagine, the doctors are gathered around Elaine attempting to intubate using a variety of techniques and pieces of equipment. Meanwhile, the other team present are doing some things under their own initiative. By the time we're 10 minutes in, with hindsight, and that's really important to say, with hindsight, we know that this is a situation of can't intubate, can't ventilate. A recognised emergency in anaesthesia for which guidelines exist. It's worth pausing at this moment to consider the situation. So Elaine is blue, her oxygenation 40% or lower for some 6 minutes or so, and everything they've tried seems to have failed. But we are in an operating theatre that's as well equipped as you would hope. We have an experienced team. The anaesthetist is regarded by his colleagues as diligent and careful. And indeed, a couple of years ago, I met someone who had been working for him at the time. And she said to me, if I'd wanted to be anaesthetised, I would have wanted him to do it. The ENT surgeon had over 30 years' experience. The other anaesthetist had additional skills pertaining to difficult airways. And of the 4 other staff present, 3 of them were all experienced in their role. If this emergency had to occur, then arguably this is the dream team to deal with it. But what we know actually happened is that the team, under the stress, probably became fixated. The doctors were looking at intubation as the only solution and persisted with their attempts. And that by the time that we're 25 minutes in, the point at which Elaine's oxygenation has been 40% or lower for over 20 minutes, they eventually get it back up to 90%. They're not happy with the security of the airway. They fiddle around some more. The oxygenation falls again, and by the time we're 35 minutes in, they make the decision that they're going to let Elaine wake up naturally and abandon the operation for today. Of course, as you can imagine, that's clearly not going to work. And in effect, it took an hour and a half or so before, under the care of another anaesthetist, they decided that Elaine was going to be transferred across here to the intensive care unit, and of course by this stage it was in effect too late. We had an independent review done. I went into the inquest in October of that year, and because of my own background perhaps in aviation and the science of human factors, I was perhaps able to ask some more pertinent questions to try and understand what had happened. And I'll share a little bit of that with you now. In his own words, the lead anaesthetist lost control. There was a dispute in the inquest about who people felt was in charge at different points. The decision making, as I said, become fixated, but we know under stress that's perfectly normal. People do get fixated. It's how you then handle it that becomes important. The prioritisation of duties became confused because their understanding of the big picture, the situational awareness of what was happening, what it meant and what needed to happen, wasn't shared amongst the three doctors. The communication processes dried up, which again we know is fairly normal in these extreme situations. But the story with the two ODPs who were now present and the two recovery nurses was very different. They were generally aware as what was happening and what needed to happen. When 6 minutes in, the senior ODP called for help, she asked her colleague to fetch the tracheostomy tray. There was already a quick tracheostomy in theatre. Her colleague came in and she announced to the doctors that she had the tracheostomy tray available. But to quote from the inquest, they simply didn't seem to perceive she was there. And under stress, we know that's not unusual. One of the recovery nurses came in, she saw Elaine's colour, she saw her vital signs, and instinctively she knew this was very serious. She went out, she phoned intensive care, she came back in, she announced to the doctors that a bed was available in intensive care across here, and again, to quote from the inquest, they looked at her as if to say, "What's wrong? You're overreacting." And she got that sense so strongly that she went and cancelled the bed. In summary then, there are apparent failings here in situational awareness, in leadership, decision-making, prioritisation, team working and assertiveness. And these same factors, these same human factors or issues around non-technical skills, we know are the direct cause of 75% of aviation accidents. So as you can imagine, I've spent the last 13 years trying to get my life back together, to get back to flying, to bring up 2 children. And I'll talk to you a little bit about that later. But also I couldn't just get out of my head, so what does this tell me about healthcare? I mean, in the nicest sense, I had no interest in the NHS, other than the fact every year I had to pass a medical for my flying. And I started just to kind of think about it and do a bit of study. It's very easy to focus on, in this case, things like cognitive capacity, of personal stress, alertness, of the effect of colleagues and teamwork and all those sorts of things. In aviation, we spend a lot of time talking about this term non-technical skills, and I'll come back to this diagram in a minute. What do I mean by non-technical skills? I mean the things that you probably do not learn about at nursing school, at medical school, or whatever college or professional body you're part of as a professional. Things like situational awareness, decision-making, leadership, teamworking, workload management. These have an enormous bearing on the success of anything you do in any complex situation or any complex human endeavour. And what we're very good at in aviation, and we're seeing it now in healthcare, Royal College of Surgeons of Edinburgh use some frameworks very similar to this, for example. Royal College of Anaesthetists are getting more engaged with it now, is we're starting to see some interest in these things because they do have such an effect. And what we do is we don't just talk about them generally, we look at specific behaviours. So what do we mean by that? What do we actually look for in an individual? What can we teach individuals to do to help get it right? But intriguingly, there's some things that we didn't see too much of in Elaine's case, and actually across healthcare, right from the most junior levels right to the most senior levels, there are some behaviours that I've picked out that I see quite rarely. And it's worth just having a look at those for a moment. But certainly there's some of those that I think might have made a difference in Elaine's case, and there are many of those things that I see almost daily in stories I hear across the healthcare sector, not just here but internationally. And we need to start looking at these. And people sometimes say to me, you know, what's the one thing I can do, Martin? That's great, you talk about all this stuff, you talk about how we can change the system, but I can't do that. What can I just do as an individual? And I always say, okay, start to look into non-technical skills, because that's stuff you can start to do now. By the way, I'm assessed on these at least 4 times a year in my current role. And these are the deal breakers. It's very rare that a pilot fails any form of check or anything because of poor technical skills. It's almost always the non-technical skills that makes the difference. But the problem is, when we talk about this diagram and when we focus on just that moment, we focus on a small part of human factors, because human factors is so much more than just how we behave. On that day, on the 29th of March 2005, I would argue that team delivered exactly what they were set up to deliver. They actually did nothing wrong. They behaved in the way they always behaved, and it had always worked. But on that one occasion, it didn't. And the whole system sets you up to behave and to work in a particular way. And when we look at a definition of human factors, and don't worry about noting this down, by the way, this fairly complex definition from a colleague of mine, it's all about a whole series of things. It's not just about team working, it's about the tasks, the workspace, the environment, the culture. In short, it's about this. Whether we're talking about how you behave as individuals, whether we're talking about how the system is set up, we need to design systems in healthcare and design ways of behaving that make it easy to do the right things. And Joe talked earlier on today, for some of you who are here, about some of the values of the organisation, some of the things you want. How do we make it easy for people to do those things is really the kind of critical question. So let's talk about the system a little bit. Some of you might recognise these characters. Any of you into Formula One? If you're not, I'll explain. Any of you know who they are? Ayrton, Senna and Sid Watkins. So Ayrton Senna, the racing driver on the left. Ayrton died in a tragic accident about 25 years ago in a Formula One race. Sid Watkins, Professor Sid Watkins, was the Chief Medical Officer of Formula One. About 10 years ago, I was very lucky to spend an evening with Sid in London over dinner, and I was able to talk to him and learn about what had happened with Senna and how Sid reacted to that. Sid was devastated. Here was a young, gifted individual who was going to make a world of difference in Formula One, and he had died. And Sid was absolutely gutted by that. What Sid didn't do was he didn't go to the racing drivers and say, hey guys, slow down, take it easy, because he knew that wasn't going to work. What he did do is he started to campaign for subtle changes to track design. He started to get the governing body, the FIA, to make subtle changes to the rules. He started to talk to the manufacturers about subtle changes to car design to incentivise safety. He started to standardise the medical facilities at Formula One tracks. In the 25 years prior to Senna's death, an average of 1 Formula One driver had died each year in a racing accident. In the 25 years since Senna's death, only 1 driver, I believe, has died as a result of a Formula One accident. And that is a lesson in system safety brought to you not by a pilot, but by a doctor. And we still get kind of into, you know, individual behaviours, and we think it's all about the individual. So if you remember this picture from a few weeks ago, the Southwest airline that had the uncontained engine failure. Sadly, a passenger was partially sucked out and died of the trauma involved. But the crew did a fantastic job, and Tammy Jo Schultz, the captain, and her team rightly praised for everything they did. But we kind of missed the point, though. When we look at this work from NASA, from Bob Heinrich from many years ago, that crew were actually working at this end. They were mitigating the consequences of an error. The error was we gave them an engine that could explode like that. What we want to do is we actually want to avoid that in the first place. But then we look at healthcare. Some of you will find this unbelievable, by the way, that we give you drugs that do different things, but we put them in similar packaging. The NHS has vast purchasing power, so you'd have thought we'd kind of be able to sort that, but we don't seem to be able to sort it yet. And we give it to you, and we say, hey guys, be careful, don't make a mistake, double check. We give you the error-prone situation, and we then expect you to manage it. And that happens all across healthcare everywhere around the world. And I've just mentioned drugs packaging, but we can talk about the design of pumps where the keypads are in different orders. We can talk about all sorts of things. And this is from Helicopter Emergency Medicine team, by the way. What could possibly go wrong in that? It's about the design of the processes. On the south of England, a number of years ago, a patient presented at A&E, a healthy male. He'd had an apparent fit. And so A&E basically sent him home. They said, right, what you need to do is to come back, you need to have a scan, and we're going to put you in front of a neurologist to try and work out what's happening. It took 9 months for him to get back in front of a neurologist with a copy of that scan, because the system for doing that meant that there were various people had to type various things, they had to transpose from one system to another by paper, they had to make phone calls, and of course 20 steps to get him into that meeting with the neurologist with that scan, 20 opportunities to get it wrong. And as I say, 9 months later, it was an inoperable brain tumour. What they did when they looked at the system is they realised actually they could streamline it to 3 steps. 3 steps does not guarantee this won't ever happen again, but 3 steps reduces the opportunity to screw up, and by the way, from a business point of view, is a darn sight more efficient as well. And there are many, many examples of that. And again, Joe talked about the importance of collaboration with the wider system. Absolutely. We need to think of this as a big system and think about how we make it easy to get things right. This is an example of some work came from a guy called René Amalberti, a French professor who does a lot of work around patient safety now. I've changed the diagram slightly, but let me just talk you through it. So you all drive at 70 miles an hour on the M1. I know you don't go any faster because I can see you're all very safe people. I get that. And that's the speed limit after all, so you wouldn't go above 70, would you? But you know what? Sometimes you're a bit late, and after all, everybody else is going a bit faster, so that's probably okay, isn't it? So we go a little bit faster, and then sometimes that becomes habitual, and we suddenly find ourselves going really, really fast. And of course, that's desperately dangerous. That normalisation of deviance, though, affects organisations. And my observation from 13 years in healthcare is this. In aviation, we tend to live around the 70 mile an hour zone. We very rarely go beyond it unless there is a really good safety reason to break the rules. And occasionally there is. Nuclear, very similar. Rail network, very similar. My observation in healthcare is that most people live in this zone permanently. Not because you're bad people, not because you're gash, but because you're trying to get the job done in spite of the system, not because of it. And that places an enormous amount of stress on you as individuals, it places an enormous amount of stress on the leadership, and we need to recognise that. And our challenge over the coming years is to be able to differentiate in healthcare and make it easy to follow the rules most of the time, by understanding the impact of those rules, but recognising there will be extreme situations where you have to be here. And they will always exist in healthcare, where you have to go outside the rules because it's the quickest, easiest and safest way of helping somebody live. I am absolutely passionate about getting a just and learning culture in healthcare, and I think things are changing. I've seen some big changes over the last 13 years. When something goes wrong, we kind of have a choice. When something major goes wrong, Was it inadvertent human error? In other words, was somebody doing their best, but for whatever reason it didn't work out? And what we usually find is when that's the case, we usually find the system is the issue. And if we try and understand what happened, we can make a massive difference by changing the system. Or at the other extreme, was it grossly negligent, manslaughter? Was it a deliberate act, the kind of Harold Shipman and Ian Patterson situation? The problem is, healthcare tends to assume too often it's this end of the scale. And I don't mean people outside healthcare, I mean people in healthcare. We love to know who was at fault, who's to blame, where did it happen, who was it? And one of the strengths of the last 13 years of talking about Elaine's case is I never talk about where it happened. And I think it helps for them to learn from it because they think, you know what, this could be this hospital, wherever this hospital is. It could be me. We need to assume most of the time it's down this end and we need to learn from it. That team who looked after Elaine, I have no doubt, was inadvertent human error. There was no question of it. And we go to somewhere like the Scottish Clinical Simulation Centre in Stirling, and what they do is they run a scenario where they get a whole operating theatre team in and they present them with Elaine's case and they all nod and they say, yeah, well, we wouldn't have done that. That's obvious. I would never do that. That's stupid, you know. A week later, they have them back in at the simulation centre and they present them with a very different scenario. It's a mannequin, it's a knife attack victim, so a very different scenario. And it deteriorates into a can't intubate, can't ventilate. The majority of people go down the same route as happened in Elaine's case. And only then, when we understand that, can we start to learn. People have said some lovely things to me over the last 13 years about the work that I do, and it's been very touching. But I could not do what I do, I could not make the difference that I've been involved in as a small part if it wasn't for the fact that the anaesthetist in the offices there in Milton Keynes, in the council offices where we held the inquest, was able to stand up and say, I'm sorry, I got it wrong. His honesty, his humility, his apology meant that I was able to learn so much more about what happened, and I felt able to move on and do something useful. And it wasn't just him, it was the ODPs, it was the recovery nurses who were present that day, who were just the same. And because of that, this death has made a difference. And I appreciate you can't read some of this stuff on here that I have received over the years. Probably about once a month I get an email or a letter or something like that that says, I just want to let you know I saved a life today. And the story, as you can see there's a comment from the Anchorage Fire Department in Alaska. Elaine's story just hasn't made a difference in healthcare, it's actually made a difference to a whole series of industries which I would have never have expected and I never deliberately tried to do. But the point here is this isn't just about can't intubate, can't ventilate, this is trying to take the lessons much wider. So where have we got to? Human factors is now taught to many undergrads, certainly in nursing, in doctors, amongst midwives, I know that. We're starting to see recognition of the essential role of human factors by numerous national organisations, whether the CQC, Healthcare Education England, whether we're talking about GMC, NMC, etc., etc., etc. We're starting to see a lot of non-technical skills, team resource management programs being used across a number of providers, some at a very large scale as well. The formation of the Healthcare Safety Investigation Branch would not have happened had it not been for an understanding of what happened to Elaine. And certainly better investigation is now a real feature, I think, of healthcare. We're not perfect, there's a long way to go. And actually, when you talk at very senior levels of the system, it's stories like Elaine's, like James Titcom's, like Scott Moorish's, who have made a difference in persuading the policymakers to start to think about the culture that we have in healthcare. I've got somebody with me today, by the way. I'd just like to introduce Victoria. So Victoria, 5 years old, is now 18. She's joined me a couple of times. Wave, stand up and wave. She's a bit short, so struggling to sit at the back. Victoria was at school in Aylesbury. She's now working, but she was at school in Aylesbury. And I was a bit surprised one day when she came home and she said, "Dad, you know we do a charities week." She said, "Well, we're going to raise money for your charity." And she delivered a talk on human factors to the students there. And 2 or 3 weeks ago, she got a text from somebody who she was at school with. I've just taken part of that text. The person she was at school with is now learning to be a midwife. Over 800 students attending where we learnt about human factors. So we know that this is starting to get wider understanding. What next, though? This is a very complex diagram. Don't worry if you can't read it, because nobody can understand it anyway. This is a very brave attempt by an organisation in 2013 to simply explain the structure of the senior NHS. If you're familiar with wiring diagrams, this is probably a lot more complex. And there's lots of organisations on here, and you look at this and scratch your head and think, I haven't got a clue how that works. The problem with that is it means to get change in the NHS takes a long time. I think as patients, we think the NHS is one organisation, and clearly it's not. It's lots of organisations who need to work together. And my challenge, particularly over the last 10 years or so, has been working with a lot of these organisations, trying to think about how they all contribute to making it easy to do the right things. And that work needs to continue. So my focus through the charity, the Clinical Human Factors Group, is really on 3 things. We want a greater focus on the system, on equipment design, tools, environment, to really get the benefits of system thinking and human factors thinking. We need to start developing a sustainable safety plan for the NHS. There's no doubt about that. And with, hopefully, discussion of funding being done beyond 5 years, we may have a chance of doing that. I put this slide together last week. Ironic to see some comments in the press today around private healthcare. We need a complete integration of private healthcare in terms of the regulatory and safety management systems of the NHS. And they need to pay for that, by the way, not the NHS. So there's a lot of work to do. What about us as a family, though? Good question. So what have we done? And what's happened to us? I've remarried. Married a lady called Jane. She was involved in various lines of work. She actually now works for the NHS, not too far away from here. You can just about see Jane back there. That's her mother, who is experiencing NHS care fairly regularly now, up in Nottingham, and being well looked after. The eldest lad at the back, Jacob, who I inherited through Jane, he's doing well for himself and is intrigued by some of the stuff I've been involved in, and has come across some of the work around human factors in his own industry, which is nothing to do with healthcare. The 20-year-old, Jane's eldest daughter, Megan, she's at King's in her 2nd year of nursing. During her 1st year at nursing, she had to go through my video 3 times, which is kind of ironic but nice. Victoria here, now working for a major UK airline herself, and Adam, was 4 years old, now 17, was only here a couple of weeks ago actually, because he himself is going to have to go through a procedure fairly soon. Is he nervous about it? No, actually he's not. Am I nervous about it? No, actually I'm not either. I have a lot more faith in the system now, because I see some of the things that are happening in healthcare. The people that I want you to think about, though, when you leave here today, are the people who were involved in Elaine's care. For them, it was just a normal day. For them, they did their very best. And they still, I know, have to live with what happened. I am pleased that they all eventually returned to work. Sadly, one of the team passed away a couple of years after Elaine's procedure. But you know what? Being back in the workplace for them is absolutely the right place, because that's where they could make a difference. And all I would say is, remember, we all make mistakes, we all screw up, and the only thing you can do is to make sure you learn.